Medical Report, and we'll track down Professor McCANNEY in a while after we do some news with Ann. And we've got some important news to talk about today. Let's start with our latest updates.
Well, I was going to wonder if you wanted to talk about the crash of the stock market on Tuesday.
Yeah. Now, what is your analysis of that?
Okay, it's kind of a complicated analysis, but if you go over to my blog, twiland.info.
Right, which, of course, I tell people they should sign up and get that email blog because it gives them amazing science and other information on things like the blog on the stock market, space weather, plagues, geothermal activities, volcanism, really important activities around what's going on around the Earth with solid science on both animal plagues like H5N2, SARS, beta coronavirus, etc., and much more. So what's on your blog? Give some of the key points, which, of course, when people go over there and they can sign up for the blog, they can actually get the full information.
Well, what happened was that the Chinese stock market has dropped about 30% in the last couple of months.
Right. And
it crashed on, well, it would have been overnight here in the United States. And, you know, when you gotta sell, you gotta sell. So,
right.
So the sellers went over to the European stock markets, and most of them crashed too. They went way down. And then when the New York Stock Exchange opened, it started going down also. And luckily, the New York Stock Exchange is affiliated with Arch, which is headquartered in Chicago. And 75% of their stock transactions can be handled by Arch. So they just started sending them over to Arch. And there were only 25% that couldn't be traded at NYSE. Now, when I describe in my blog, I have possible causes for the catastrophic financial failures.
Right.
But another one has come to me, and that is that it could have been deliberate. If you think that your stock exchange is going to crash, you might stop it and give some excuse so that it doesn't crash. And then as the prices get lower, which they did, eventually buyers will come in.
Right.
And then you can open up again. And that's exactly what NYSE did. Another possibility is that is greed. Arch was sued by the United States justice system, and they charged Arch with fraud and market manipulation in 2015 for the May 6, 2012 flash crash of the American financial markets.
Right.
So there could have been some of that going on. And, of course, software upgrades or hardware failures are always possible culprits, but I was surprised that they didn't have a chief information officer, a CIO, talk to the press. They had the CEO talk, but we don't expect the CEO to know what's going on in the computer world. And it may be that the NYSE doesn't have a CIO. A lot of big companies don't want to create that position for many reasons.
Yeah,
but I think the most possible.
I think maybe you're on the right track. Please continue.
Yeah, and then you remember that a leap second was added to the time systems at midnight on June 30th, and the companies that have the large computer systems, well, any company that has a computer system, had been warned 6 months before the time change. So they were well warned in advance as of the end of 2014. And but some computer systems have to have the leap second added manually. Well, today I heard that they're still using COBOL. I mean, COBOL was...
That's great. It's out of date.
I mean, that is really archaic.
Right. Yeah, I used that back in the 1970s, COBOL, Fortran 4, and PL1, yeah.
So at the time, the timekeeper is over in Britain. GMT is Greenwich Mean Time. And so the timekeeper, he warned, he said, we're going to make this change, but that there might be problems in the financial markets if the leap second is wrongly programmed. Well, I can't even see how they do it in cobalt because it's just so archaic, and there aren't that many people that know it anymore.
Do you think that it's likely that there was some form of manipulation in the form of financial terrorism in the financial markets? Because there's a lot of symptoms, like I call it the Jenga game of Greece, pulling the fact that it's not going to be able to manipulate the population to agree, even though Tsipras is trying to see if he's going back to the people to say, do you want us to sign this? They're having another referendum. I'm pretty certain the referendum which is happening today in Greece, which will pretty well be over now in the news, the Greeks are going to say, no way, we don't want the left leg cut off because the right leg was cut off last year. So, the Greeks aren't going to vote for more austerity. They're going to vote to actually have the debt written off, called a haircut. And Angela Merkel and the banks in Germany are saying, we're not going to agree with this. Of course, the banks in Germany and France and Spain and so on that loaned this money, because the euro is basically just another name for the German Deutschmark. And what I think is going to happen is that the financial system of Europe is in the process of crashing. Because China is so heavily invested, you see, part of the thing with China is that although transnational corporations are invested there, 80% of the billionaires are Chinese. They have to invest their money around the world, whether it's in Brazil or Europe or elsewhere. And when their heavy investments in Greece, which are highly leveraged, start to crash, their stock market to start to go down because a lot of their loans are shark loans, over 20%. And the Chinese have already had trouble with their manufacturing, with shipping their goods, so they build 100,000 warehouses to store things they can't ship. So I think that the world economic system is on life support. And I think the powers that be decided it was time to pull it. As they say, like the Building 7 with Silverstein back in 9/11, they pulled it, which means they could do the controlled demolition of the economy. And I think there's more demolitions coming because it's not yet completely collapsed. And the powers that be want to make sure they wrest control of this new system they're going to create, where I think they're going to want to get rid of physical cash. And we know what that means in the Bible for Christians. It means the mark of the beast. They want to get rid of physical cash because they say it's too expensive to have money if you have a extremely low interest rate policy of interbank loans. So the only way to save that system is to have a system without cash at all.
Well, that's possible. I think more likely what happened was that they just didn't want their system to crash, so they stopped the trading.
Of course, that's what I mean. They're trying to do a controlled demolition. So, in other words, they want to whatever is demolished, they want to make sure they teach the other parties playing this game, like China and the BRICS nation, play ball with us or we're going to play hardball with you, which is why Tsipras is going back to the people to ask again if they will agree to this the whole process. Right? Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, what I've heard is that there's a split in the leadership in China. We have the communists in the leadership, and then we have these capitalists, these young bucks. And they've allowed them to open several stock exchanges in China.
Right.
And I heard that the communist part of the leadership could have bailed out the markets, the stock markets, but they didn't. And of course, people lost a lot of money. I mean, this could bankrupt buying commodities, for instance. Now, China's already bought commodities from the United States. Even before the crop was grown.
Yeah, and they buy it in advance, don't they? They put the money down, even buying, long-term leases in Brazil and elsewhere around the world to be able to grow crops.
Yes.
Back in a moment with Ann Morrison, and we're going to be talking to Professor McCANNEY. Lots to talk about here, this show, about many important topics. We'll be back in just a minute. In a moment with Professor McCANNEY. Let's hit the highlights of these other stories. You're talking about on the break, and about Greece and about the Chinese. The Silk Road that they've established, which means major investment in Greece. In fact, probably the Greek issues going on right now have had a major, negative effect on the Greek stock market, on the Chinese stock market, because they're so heavily invested in Greece. I would think that would be a factor, wouldn't you?
Oh, exactly. And I think that one of the reasons that China is doing this, they have an initiative called the Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road. So they've already built like super highways from East China all the way into across Turkmenistan and Iran and Turkey, and then up to Moscow, over to Rotterdam, the Netherlands, Venice, Italy, and then the Maritime Silk Road goes from Athens, Greece, and then down through the Suez Canal into Kenya, and then back up to Calcutta, India, down to Sri Lanka, and then Indonesia, and then back up to East China. And I think one of the reasons they're doing this is because China has a huge population, and they cannot afford, especially with the stock market crash, they're not going to be able to buy all the food that they're going to need to feed their people. And we talked about this well, we didn't do it last week because you were gone, because we weren't on last week. But the insurance report out of Lloyd's of London said that it's the food system crisis. If people can't get food, they aren't going to stand for it. They're going to riot or something. And I think that
China is very close to rioting, because worldwide there's food security is gone. That's why we talked about this last week, and you had some major breaking news on that about the food security issues of wheat and rice and so on. China is literally leasing land in Brazil and other countries to try to grow food, and in Africa they're trying to modernize the railway and bring in the hospitals, because their own lands are being encroached by the expansion of the Gobi Desert. In fact, a lot of the big cities, even like Beijing and northern cities in China, are inundated with dust and sand, so for days and weeks you can't see anything because there's so much pollution just from the dust storms from these expanding deserts.
Yeah, that's part of the climate change scenario. Right. Anyway, I think that one of the reasons they're building up these trade routes is so that their people can get out of China and move into other parts of the world. If there's going to be riots, their people are going to leave China and try to go where the food is. And so if
you'll
right
see
now
a massive
the road,
migration to Brazil and South America,
goes to Europe and Russia and the Mideast.
Right.
And so that's where we would expect a huge. I mean, you're talking a huge migration of people if they can't feed them, and then the stock market crashes. I mean, 30% reduced in value. Well, 30% reduction in value means that companies have failed. That means that workers are being laid off. It's a huge drain for China.
In China, they have, for every job they have in China, they have 9 qualified people that could take that job. So China basically is on its last legs. And that's why when we talk about the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, which has been hit by climate change, which of course I think is geoengineered, Russia, which has been hit with the Saudi Arabian oil breaking their back by bringing the price of oil down to $53 a barrel now. It was even lower back in January. With China, literally a lot of the manufacturing jobs and transnational corporations moving to Kerala, India, and Malaysia and elsewhere, and the Chinese were trying to get better wages. What's happening is they were modernizing the city at an enormous pace, and they've just been chopped right off, because 5 years ago they actually wouldn't allow transnational corporations to own 51% of any Chinese company by the Communist Party. And since that policy, the transnational corporations say, we're out of here. And they even had riots preventing the CEOs and senior officers of these corporations to leave. They actually tried to kidnap them in China, in major cities. So China is in big trouble because they don't honor industrial or intellectual property rights, patents. They $200 billion plus per year industrial espionage that the Chinese are doing all over the world. They are starting to innovate, but the problem is, if you can manufacture it cheaper in India or Malaysia or elsewhere, they're doing it, and the transnational corporations say, we're just picking up the factory and we're moving it elsewhere. So China is going to be is in big trouble. And of course, at the same time, they have another track. There's an arm of China that wants to create an advanced military, so they're building these islands off in the Spratly Islands in the Philippines, which is a conflict zone with Japan. And they're now trying to say we want the oil in the South China Sea because it's our territory. And of course, all these other countries have had territorial rights there for a long time. So China's trying to see if it can kind of struggle financially and militarily with the rest of the world, and they're going to have a rough time, aren't they?
Well, but I think they're preparing for a rough time. I think they're going to export their dissidents. I think that's one reason they're building this infrastructure, this Silk Road, and they call it a Silk Road economic belt, which means that they expect that towns and cities will spring up along these superhighways, and it'll create economic activity for whoever's there. I think that's part of the selling point. And now and they call that a belt, an economic belt, Silk Road economic belt. And then, of course, they have the maritime structure too. So this stock market crash, 30% in a couple of months, is huge. Now, they've already put out contracts on the commodities from the United States, soybean meal and they usually call that beans, and corn, and some rice, but not a lot of rice from America. And but last year or 2 years ago, what happened? They bought it before it was planted, and so it was on consignment. We shipped it over there, and they rejected it at the port. Now, what happened was,
why did they reject it? What was the reason for that?
Well, they said it was because it contained GMOs, but we denied that. And in any case...
Well, we don't have GMO corn, by the way. Our sweet corn is not genetically modified. The corn that's genetically modified is corn specifically designed for the gasohol industry. And it doesn't cross-pollinate very easily at all. So if you separate the fields, the pollen doesn't cross-pollinate. They've checked that out. So there are crops that are GMO. I tell people there's a GMO list, and we're going to get Jeffrey Smith on. He's got by the way, on Amazon, you can actually watch their movie on Genetic Roulette by Jeffrey Smith, which they did 2 months ago, back in May. That's available now. So people can watch that on Amazon. That's
great. Yeah. Anyway, so, we could still sell it. We couldn't sell it at top price. They bought it at top price. But they rejected us, so we just sold it to India and Indonesia and that area of the world, because those people wanted that those soybeans as well as China did.
Yeah, no, the soybeans are a high percentage of them are genetically modified, not the corn. The soy is GMO. You have to know each one, particularly in which organic acids and other molecules in each one are causing problems or unstable plasmids. It's complicated. On your blog, the Fusaria, of course, creates a biotoxin that when they cook the bread with Fusaria, it was felt as a bioweapon years ago, this fungus. But when it grows in crops, you have to cut off parts of the fields because it's a very nasty toxin, and it can kill people. I call it the bread of death. Because you bake the bread, I think the people you talked about, 60% of them died after they had Fusaria contaminated wheat heads. Tell us about the story.
Yeah, that was over in the Soviet Union, and so the Soviets, of course, they found out what the mycotoxin was, and they concentrated it, and then they used it to kill people in the Middle East between 75 and 81. And it was called the yellow rain. They just sprayed it over the people, and they died.
Yeah, they had helicopters, and they had yellow rain compressed tanks in these helicopters, and they just zip the helicopter and spray them with yellow rain, and the rain would fall, and they die.
That's right. And now you have to understand that we're going to have a problem with our wheat crop this year because we're having Fusarium mold growing the wheat. And our USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, will inspect the fields and say, well, you can't sell that and you can't sell that. But the U.S. will import grains, wheat in particular, and other countries are not nearly as careful as we are. And so it could be that the bread you eat will have Fusarium in it and you'll get sick and die. And so this is going to...
It's a hard symptom to get over, is the bread of death, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be the bread of death, all right.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is, often these fields, when the farmers can't sell the wheat, the fields will be mowed for hay to be fed to livestock. Well, it's deadly to livestock, too. And sometimes they'll surreptitiously sell it to unaware bakers.
Oh my.
People, just small bakers. So, you got to be mighty careful what you eat this year.
Yeah, and what's happening basically because of the climate shift where it's warm and dry and then very wet, it tends to grow pathogens and mold. And worldwide, I see this fall we're seeing the start of what I call the collapse of food supplies and commodities worldwide. And as the economy starts to kind of wind down with the velocity of money and the credit worldwide and the stock market and derivatives literally starting to crash, remember it's all a controlled demolition because they could easily fix this by writing off debt like it's a Shemitah or a write-up, was called a wipeout year. They could easily fix it, but they won't. I want to switch gears to Professor McCANNEY. He had an excellent run of shows all over the place talking about many, many issues. He was over on Power Hour, I think, for a couple of shows talking about people that were egging on Joyce Riley to talk about Planet X and other things. And I'd like to start off with that because I think that gets the juices rolling, doesn't it, Professor McCANNEY? And we want to clarify a number of issues. Firstly, number one, I agree with Professor McCANNEY on most things. In fact, there's no evidence that there's an object in our inner solar system. I have classified sources of information that there is an object out there. It's most likely more than one object, which includes things like Hale-Bopp and so on. And there is something that they've been looking for at the South Pole Telescope with the Pi Meson scope, Chandra X-ray telescope, stereoscopic infrared or IRAS scopes in deep space. There are actions at a distance that create gravity waves and plasma effects across the solar system. And, of course, these hyperelliptical comets coming in are being pushed in by an object in the Oort cloud, which is out at 0.73 light years. That's a long way out. And a gradual increase in cataclysms over the last century is probably caused by the approach of objects in deep space. Some of them are comet size, some are planet size, some are we call dwarf star size, which are red or brown dwarf stars. And there's 10,000 of these. Only 10% are entrained in an orbital pattern with a star system. Most of them are wandering because their initial star system is long gone dead and been a silent cinder for billions of years, because dwarf stars will last from 10 trillion to 100 trillion years long after their parent star is gone. And what people need to understand is that the nature of the universe is cataclysm. Even our continent formation is due to lithospheric disjunction between the crust of the Earth and the mantle. The water comes not only from the tail of comets, but primarily comes from the planet itself. And plasma physics, like Professor McCANNEY has coined the term years ago, it's an electric universe, and you have to understand that we are in a, if you want to call it it's a laser tag place, basically, between space objects and plasma physics that changes and regulates our weather and even the action of the sun and the radiation spectra that it's giving off, which is considerably different than when we were children, much higher energy levels of ultraviolet light, etc. So, Professor McCANNEY, you have the stage. Tell us, clarify the kind of things that went on. And it's interesting, nobody was gutsy enough to challenge you on your statements, because a lot of people have taken your information out of context and run with it. I do believe that there are deep space objects that are affecting or will affect our planet, but there's certainly no evidence in our solar system now. But there's a lot of people that will run with things without full understanding or take it out of context. And they don't understand, yes, I do believe that we're going to have the passage of large objects like a large comet, like Jupiter, like Venus, which Velikovsky and Einstein thought. To clarify all these points, because I think people should understand, yeah, cataclysm is coming, but it's not here. Professor McCANNEY, I hope we are still connected. I think we may have lost our connection with Professor McCANNEY. Well, and let's continue while we're trying to get a hold of Professor McCANNEY. I know he has having his internet guy there wherever he is. Of course, this is classified information. And let's continue with your news. Okay, well,
I have a list of Category B agents, and one of them is melioidosis, which we have, they've done a study of it, and come to find out, even though it's on a Category B agent, a select agent, it is not reportable. And so if people have melioidosis, the physicians don't have to report that to the CDC. So that's it's a gap in our biosecurity network. Ricin is also a Category B bioweapon, and because of apparently an episode from Breaking Bad, which dealt with making ricin from castor beans. A couple of men, one from Iowa and the other one in Pennsylvania, decided to poison their enemies with ricin. And they were caught before any damage was done. But, it grows so easily. Castor bean grows so easily that they don't even try to stamp it out. What they do is they treat the seed before you get it. And you can plant them as ornamentals, but the seed you get is not capable of producing ricin. They coat it with something, right? So, but somehow they thought that they were going to do that, and that just shows the effect of what a series like Breaking Bad can do. People just
they broke. In other words, they broke bad. The series put out too much information. It's called TMI. To people that basically lack parts of the nature of what it is to be a human being, which is common sense, and the idea of the danger, which would repel people from doing things that are stupid or dangerous, because castor beans nasty stuff, and ricin. I mean, it's the kind of thing like on Breaking Bad and these other shows that if you take it, 2 days later you have a vicious death, not just a nasty death. You have a vicious death.
And you definitely don't want to grow castor bean plants. They are decorative and they're pretty, but you don't want to grow them around where children will be, because even the leaves will give a child a dermatitis. In other words, the leaves are poisonous too. And so you have to be very careful where you grow it. You have to, you have to use some common sense there. But people do grow it, especially in their landscaping.
Yeah. Now let's go look at some of the other issues.
Yeah,
volcanism, earthquakes, and other plagues, volcanism, earthquakes. I hear the bumper coming on. We're moving into our last segment. Hopefully, we'll get some dialogue from Professor McCANNEY on some of these issues. As I opened a 6-foot-tall can of worms, which I will do on the show, and of course, I have my own sources of information on these issues. And you do a fantastic job, Ann, of bringing all these news items forward. Scary world out there, I'll tell you. This reads like the plagues of the ancient Egyptians at the time. And so when we look at all these things kind of converging, and I want to go through some of the other issues here. We've got China's economy and their stock market crossing 35%. We have the stock market literally having a hiccup where they shut it down here in New York after the European stock market got hit. We've got climate change causing shortages of food and commodities around the world, which means that by this fall, we'll be in full force what I call worldwide famine of some commodities. Somewhere somebody's going to start starving. We have issues with climate change that's being interfered with, not so much by deep space objects, because I do think there are climatic effects from deep space plasma physics, but we're also having problems with the geoengineering of the world climate, which is amplifying drought worldwide and also increasing extreme rainfall, where climate systems are stalling. For example, over North America and Texas, I think a month and a half ago, that system, which is like biblical in terms of the amount of rain and the amount of rain that fell over Tbilisi in Georgia in the South Caucasus Mountains, the animals got out and one tiger killed one man and injured another, and then they eventually shot him, and the hippo was running around because the flood was so great the entire containment area of the zoo in Tbilisi broke down. All these kind of things are really starting to, the population of Earth is going to start scrambling to where can they move to away from bad climatic changes, and where can they move to away from the dangers for all kinds of other things, food shortages, water shortages, and a lot of these are problems that can be easily solved with primary water. And the globalists are doing modification of the weather. I mean, there's the United Nations Office for Geoclimatic Change. I met with the director of the World Constitution Parliament Association back in '97 in Colorado Springs when he was at a conference, and we spent the entire evening talking about his plan as a physicist for modifying world climate, putting nanoparticles up. And of course, the reason why he shared is because I was a doctor taking care of pilots and technicians flying out of Buckley and Peterson and Aurora Airport, flying actually to modify the world weather back in the mid-'90s. So I knew this because I worked with the employees of U.S. Space Command, Strategic Defense, and Star Wars in these classified military projects, and our government's been involved with screwing around with the weather for a long time. And I know the specific technical details of how they do it. Unfortunately, many people putting up YouTube don't give me credit because I'm the only one telling them specifically how it works. No one else publicly that knows this stuff is speaking publicly to explain it to people, and they have to understand that they need to stop doing that so the jet stream restores to normal. They need to stop putting corrects at the wellhead because they're still putting it down deep at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, which is why the loop current's not restored to normal. It's a pacemaker for world climate. And why they're messing around with the plasma physics of the upper atmosphere, which is dangerous. And we don't talk about what's called magmatic water, which means that the caldera for Yellowstone, there's tons of water. There's an ocean of water down there. Just like every fault line is magmatic, there's lots of water if you go and use the geological maps for earthquakes across America, which is a grid pattern. Or as I talked to 2 engineers here at the Vista Irrigation District, and one a conservation engineer, I asked him about primary water, and what I had to do is say, now pretend that I am your professor and you're now doing an oral exam for your master's degree, and I'm going to fire tough questions at you. So don't just dismiss me as a citizen calling in. I'm a scientist. And at the end of it, you could tell that these guys were the incredible shrinking scientists. They realized they're not going to pass the oral exam. And that's disturbing. It's disturbing to have people that are in scientific positions of authority that don't take seriously the issue of primary water or water systems like North American Water and Power, or the seriousness of climatic change, which is caused by geoengineering of the climate, when we can prove it. We've had movies that talk about the amount of nanoparticle aluminum and come out Shasta where there's no aluminum smelters nearby. We can talk about the ultraviolet light caused by Fukushima Daiichi that's just causing rapid change in what's called gene drift, creating new plagues like H5N2, which are now killing off our turkeys and chickens. People need to connect the dots here, that whatever, whether it's global government, the United Nations, and the International Monetary Fund, or our government, which is basically now with these treaties trying to make the Congress and Senate basically vestigial, or any government anywhere trying to create what we call trade territory zones, it's all very dangerous because these people are universally incompetent. Universally incompetent. And they don't follow good science, they don't have good policy, and basically their policies are, we don't care a rat's behind if we kill 90% of the world's population because that's one of their goals. People say, no, Dr. Deagle, that's a conspiracy theory. I said, conspiracy means 2 or 3 people get together to do something bad, and it's a theory because there's evidence to support it. How's that? So what do you think, Ann? I mean, and same thing when I heard the stories with Professor McCANNEY and nobody wants to answer, and I have to temper this to tell people there are deep space objects. I know from classified sources out in deep space. There is a dwarf star out there, not just planet-sized comets. There is action at a distance with gravity waves affecting the geoclimatic and geotectonic events here on Earth, and the plasma physics of the upper atmosphere. And I have other sources of information that tell me that this object is not in our near space. God help us if it ever does come in. And if it does pass, which it probably has passed in the past between Mars and Jupiter, it'll be very damn dangerous. And it'll have an entire orbital mass of objects orbiting around it, this dwarf star, and a debris field, which means a meteor storm coming in the tail of this thing, which can create a lot of debris. If we pass through it, it'll be pretty cataclysmic. So if you read the Bible, at some point in the future, and I'm not going to tell you when, we are going to have the passage of a deep space object that's going to cause cataclysms. That, if you understand the science of what I'm talking about and you look at the Bible through scientific glasses and the plasma physics and the near space objects, that's what we're facing at some point in the future. And I'm not saying it's here yet, but it's coming. So what do you think, Ann?
Well, I do think that we have seen an uptick in the number of earthquakes, especially large earthquakes. And of course, we've seen the migration of the North Magnetic Pole from the New World to the Old World.
Right. And we know some of these things have been gradually increasing over a century. Tycho Brahe, that discovered this about the perturbations of Neptune, was calculating this out over a century ago in Denmark. So we're not talking about something that's fast. It's something that's slow in action at a distance that's out at light years away from the planet Earth. But it's a very massive, supermassive object with a very powerful magnetic and plasma field around it. And I tell people that don't understand advanced astronomy or plasma physics and so on, they'll misjudge. For example, I agree with Professor McCANNEY that there's an object out there that was probably mistaken by these other scientists as Hale-Bopp. But Hale-Bopp is only a tiny fraction of the size even of the moon. It's not going to affect action at a distance, at that distance away from the planet, that'll change the climate or even the solar activity of the sun, or the radiation of X-rays and ultraviolet light, infrared light coming from Jupiter, which is a star, technically, because it gives off more radiation in certain bands of the spectra than it receives from the sun. So Jupiter, by technical definitions, is a star Jupiter. It's not a planet, it's a star planet. It's a hybrid. And people need to understand that. They also need to understand that there are 10,000 brown and red dwarf stars in our galaxy. So out of 460 billion stars, you can multiply that by 10,000 at least of dwarf stars, and only 10% are entrained in an orbital pattern that's usually hyperelliptical because they've been captured by a star gravitational system like our sun, which captured this dwarf star that passes on a periodic passage through the Earth through the southern ecliptic. And they know this because I have classified sources. I took care of the team that went down to the Pi Meson scope, the South Pole Telescope radar. It was called the radio telescope down there. They have a giant array, and a Pi Meson scope, which is below the ice shelf, as well as IRAS and Chandra. I know this, okay? I have my own sources. So when people want to say they disagree with McCANNEY, I have to clarify this. I agree with McCANNEY on about 90% of the stuff, but I have to say, at some point in the future, we're going to be facing some fairly nasty things. But it'll be very evident, and you can't see it because it's 7 degrees above absolute zero with a visible telescope. And you can only see it with X-ray telescope, with what's called a torsion field scope, which is basically looking at gravitonic waves from deep space, and from things like radio telescope. You cannot see this object with normal telescopy. It's not possible. But believe me, the globalists, including the Vatican, are fully aware of it because they have one of the largest radio telescopes at Arecibo in Chile, and they're fully aware of it. What do you think, Ann?
Well, I want to tell our listeners that they need to build up their food stores, they need to be prepared to grow food, and they need to be able to protect what they've stored away from looters.
Well, as busy as I am as a doctor, I have my greenhouses stocked and rocking, making lots of good food, including Mexican chili peppers and cumin and spices and everything. I got fruit and nut trees, and I'm armed to the teeth. And I'm going to make myself my own little drones and other exotic weapons, so don't bug me if you want to.
Have you ever wondered if